My name is Melvin Tinker, and I'm the Senior Minister of St John's Newland in Hull. And I'm delighted at the thought of coming to New Word Alive this year, and to be speaking on a subject which is very dear to my heart and something which I'm very passionate about, and that is what the Bible has to say about the doctrine of providence. Now, sometimes when you mention something like that, some people sort of recoil and think, goodness me, this seems a wee bit heavy. But I'm mindful of something C.S. Lewis said back in the 1940s when he was doing the series of broadcasts for the BBC during the Second World War, which then became the book Mere Christianity. And he came to the point where he was going to speak on the doctrine of the Incarnation and the Trinity. And he was advised, whatever you do, don't touch it. Because, they said, well, people aren't interested in theology. They just want practical religion. And he said, I rejected that advice for two reasons. First of all, people aren't fools. And secondly, since theology is the science of God, if people are going to know God, then they've got to have the clearest and most accurate ideas about him available. And that certainly is the case when we come to this doctrine of providence. Now, we don't hear much about providence today, and in fact, we've not heard much about providence during the 20th century, which seems a wee bit strange, given that in earlier centuries it was a big deal. For example, if you look at the writings of ordinary soldiers during the American Civil War, whether they were from the North or the South, you'll find numerous references to the doctrine of providence. And one particularly notable person is General Stonewall Jackson, where he had such a strong view that God was in control of everything, that from the great control of the galaxies right down to the nitty-gritty of life. He believed that God was personally involved. So much so that people said of him that he seems so calm when he goes into battle, and that he could walk into battle like he was walking through the park. And he said, well, it's simply because he did believe that God was in charge of his life. Now, that didn't mean he was a fatalist, because he also believed that God in his providence provided trees to hide behind and rocks to hide behind. So if the enemy was shooting at you, you did the most sensible thing. But then that strong view that God is a loving, transcendent, all-powerful Father who cares about his children, who's working all things to good for those who love him, as I said, sort of disappeared off the scene. And I think that's a great shame, because this wonderful teaching about providence is one of the most, I think, comforting doctrines we find in the Bible. So the sort of things I'll be talking about, and we'll be looking at these things together, is, first of all, what is providence, how are we to understand it, and how can we be strengthened by it? It's got a very strong pastoral element to it. And secondly, is providence just dealing with the big things, that God's only concerned with the big show of history, or is he also concerned about the individual, right down to the minute detail of where we were born, why we were born there, our parents, our grandparents, and how the whole thing is woven together to make us into the people God wants us to be? But then, of course, it raises up the big issue about evil. Where does suffering and evil and the devil, what part do they have to play in all of this? And we're going to be looking at that by looking particularly at the book of Job, because this is obviously one of the most important books in the Bible, which looks at the relationship between the sovereignty of God, his care for the individual, and yet the fact that we do live in a messed up, broken world, and Satan is active. And then, just on a very practical point, we're going to be looking at how God guides and what providence has to say about that. We're not fatalists. We do make real choices. But nonetheless, even then, God is involved in those choices. And the key text we'll be looking at really is Romans 8:28, that in all things God works together for the good for those who love him.